In our presentation, we'll be addressing the problems with youth protection and the steps towards achieving the TRC recommendations in restoring self-determination to Indigenous child welfare. We will have a brief history of the residential school system and its continuation into the present-day child welfare system. We'll look at the calls to action made by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the Touchstones of Hope from 2006 as a path forward. We'll then look at Jordan's Principle, and then we will critically examine the government's response to the TRC with regards to this matter. Finally, we will present organizations, individuals, and initiatives that are working towards achieving these goals. The legacy of colonization, including the residential school system, has had and continues to have harmful effects on health, well-being, and family support systems of First Nations children. The existing failure of the child welfare system in regards to First Nation, Inuit, and Métis people are a direct result of the larger consequences of colonization, which includes residential schools. From 1600 to 1800, mission schools began the assimilation of Indigenous children. Religious missions laid the foundations for the establishment of the soon-to-follow residential school system. In 1831, the Mohawk Indian Residential School opens in Bradford, Ontario. In 1845, the Bagot Commission report is presented. It established that separating Indigenous children from their parents was necessary in their assimilation into Euro-Canadian culture. The Mohawk Institute is seen as the perfect model for this process. In 1876, the Indian Act is introduced. The Act seeks to remove First Nations culture and replace it with Euro-Canadian society. Amendments to the Indian Act of 1876 provide for the creation of residential schools funded and operated by the Government of Canada and the Roman Catholic, Anglican, Methodist, Presbyterian United Churches. In 1883, the Davenport Report makes way for Sir John A. Macdonald to authorize a residential school system. The sole purpose is to destroy any remnants of the children's culture. In 1907, Chief Medical Officer for Canada's Department of the Interior and Indian Affairs inspects multiple institutions and finds horrific results. The death rate of Indigenous students is a terrifying 25%, rising even higher after being discharged from the school. In 1920, Duncan Campbell Scott, Deputy Superintendent of Indian Affairs, makes attendance mandatory for Indigenous children ranging from 7 to 16 years of age. In 1930, the system grows and now 17,000 Indigenous students are enrolled in residential schools across Canada. In 1948, in an act of defiance, the Thunder Child Indian Residential School is destroyed. Multiple fires were set at residential schools across the country to oppose colonialism. In 1951, the 60 Scoop begins. In another attempt to westernize, assimilate, and abolish Indigenous children's culture, the federal government gives provinces the right and jurisdiction to remove youth from their Indigenous families and place them with white foster care parents. In 1969, the Canadian government takes over responsibility for the remaining residential schools from the churches. In 1996, the last federally run facility closes. In the current child welfare system, Indigenous children only account for 7.7% of the entire Canadian population, but somehow make up 52.2% of the children in foster care. In 2008, as part of the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission produced 5 calls to action specifically for youth protection in regards to Indigenous children. We call upon the federal, provincial, territorial, and Aboriginal governments to commit to reducing the number of Aboriginal children in care. We call upon the federal government, in collaboration with the provinces and territories, to prepare and publish annual reports on the number of Aboriginal children who are in care compared with non-Aboriginal children, as well as the reasons for apprehension, the total spending on preventative and care services by child welfare agencies, and the effectiveness of various interventions. We call upon all levels of government to fully implement Jordan's Principle. We call upon the federal government to enact Aboriginal child welfare legislation that establishes national standards for Aboriginal child apprehension and custody cases. We call upon the federal, provincial, territorial, and Aboriginal governments to develop culturally appropriate parenting programs for Aboriginal families. Before Europeans separated Indigenous people from their land, communities were prosperous and self-reliant. They were able to care for their children and needed no outside interference. Establishment of reserves and residential schools created socioeconomic problems. Lack of cultural training led social workers to misinterpret the socioeconomic problems and assume Indigenous people were unable to properly care for their children, therefore resulting in their removal and placement into foster care or residential treatment facilities. The touchstones were created to address the ever-present lack of understanding on the part of the social worker profession, and to allow them to move forward with a new set of values to help them work collaboratively and obtain an Indigenous perspective. Current interventions continue to cause harm and are ineffective. In 2005, a conference of child care experts, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, gathered to create a guide forward towards reconciliation. They created the Touchstones of Hope. Truth-telling. Telling the story of child welfare as it has affected Indigenous children, youth, and families. Acknowledging. Affirming and learning from the past and seeing one another with new understanding and recognizing the need to move forward on a new path. Restoring. Doing what we can to redress the harm and making changes to ensure it does not happen again. Relating. Working respectfully together to design, implement, and monitor the new child welfare system. What are the 5 touchstones of hope? These principles include self-determination. Indigenous people are in the best position to make decisions that affect their communities and lead the development of laws, policies, research, and practice. Culture and language. Indigenous cultures are ingrained in all theory, research, policy, and practice that affect their communities. Holistic approach. Approaches to working with Indigenous communities recognize and reflect the distinct realities of the whole community, including culture, tradition, spirituality, social customs, language, environment, and socioeconomic factors. Structural interventions. We stand up to injustices to protect the rights of all Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, including children and youth. Non-discrimination. Indigenous peoples are entitled to equal access to resources and services that are responsive to their needs and the unique cultural context of their experience.
Created using Powtoon.